Hello, this is a beginner's overview of the Flash development environment. One of the things I love to do when I start out is very often you'll have something like designer. Here we go. It's loading up. I like to go immediately to classic mode. You may find different ways to work, but this is what I'm used to. I'm going to create a new ActionScript 3 project, which is the default. See if that'll actually work. And then things are loading slowly. You'll notice that Flash gives you a very small stage size. This is from the very early days of Flash. I don't know why they haven't changed it, but it's excellent for designing wristwatch displays. I'm going to go ahead just for today and make this something a little bit more usable, 800 by 500. In a real world project, you would probably go a little bit bigger than that, but this is fine for showing you what's on the screen. Really what I'm going to do here is focus on the tools, many of which you'll recognize pretty quickly, but Flash is very different. Flash uses wonderful vector tools. They are easy to use, but a tour is worthwhile because they work differently than the way you're used to. As a matter of fact, much of Flash is brilliant, but different than what you're used to, and a short tour will really help. I'm going to go here, this you'll recognize, and I'm going to choose a red fill and a black stroke. And the first thing I'm going to do, and you can see my different tools here, I'm going to use the rectangle tool. And I'm going to go ahead and draw a rectangle. When my tools are selected, you'll notice that if I want to click this little magnet here, I have the snap to object function. And what I can do now is you'll see that it will snap to a perfect square, much like hitting the shift key. So if I'm trying to draw squares and perfect circles and things, let's go to the circle tool, the oval tool, and because the magnet's on, it will snap to an oval. Now, one thing that's interesting, I'm going to zoom in on these things just a little bit so you can see better. Notice that if I click and drag, what happens? The fill and the stroke are different objects. If I double click and drag, the fill and the stroke move together. Now, if I happen to click the stroke, and I'll show you on the side, you see that little hair that the cursor develops on the right-hand side? If I click the stroke, only one segment gets selected. If I double click the stroke, both segments get selected. So fills and strokes and segments of strokes are actually different things. Another thing that I can do, and I'm going to go ahead and change the fill of this one, and let's double click these strokes for the moment. Move this on the screen, and I'll get rid of this one. Now, similar colors, if I drop one on top of the other, I now have one shape. Dissimilar colors, if I drop one on top of the other and deselect and drag away, will knock out. So these are vectors functioning very much like a paint program would. Now I'm going to use the eraser tool, which you would normally never use on a vector, and I'm going to go right across the middle of this strange shape I've created. And what's interesting, let's go to the timeline, and I have this lime green color, which I'm going to change to a dark purple so you can see better on your screen. When I use my black arrow, I can select these things, and I've actually used the eraser to create two vectors. If I use the white arrow, I have my Bezier curves, and you can see here the handles and things on the Bezier curves, right? So just like Illustrator, but different from Illustrator. Same thing, I can go ahead and move this on top, and all of a sudden I'm creating very organic shapes out of simple primitives. Now, another thing that's interesting with Flash is, you remember that hair that we get on the cursor? As I get close to a face of an object, I can move these like clay. So there's some very organic ways to treat shapes that are different. I can use my white arrow, my standard cursor, for editing Bezier curves, and I can get to the various points and edit things that way. Or I can use the black arrow, the eraser tool, things like that. So it's very interesting. Just to show you some of the other tools on this palette, here is the rectangle primitive tool, and this actually gives me some very interesting adjustable points. So for making rounded rectangles, that can be really useful. I can also use the oval primitive tool, which will snap to a circle like the other, but you'll notice I've got the start angle, I've got the end angle, so and then the inner radius. So there's a lot of adjustable things here for making some pretty complicated shapes quite simply. Another thing worth looking at, if you're not used to this, especially the way objects interact, I'm going to go back to my oval tool for a minute. I'm going to make another green oval, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click the oval tool, and see this? This is the object drawing mode. If the way objects stick together drives you crazy, turn on object drawing mode, and you can still very easily change the color, but watch what happens. Let's get rid of the stroke. Here I can't quite, if I double click, you can see up here I'm now inside the drawing object. I can get rid of the stroke and go back to the scene. Now when I drop these on top, deselect, the green knocks out. The drawing object is very much like making a group. In fact, I can't really tell the difference. If I wanted to take this object and say edit, I have to find where my group is, modify group, Command G, trying not to use Command keys so you can see, here it is, and as a group it won't interact. Another way to do, which we'll play with later, is I can actually put an object, let's cut this object out, I won't do it later, I'll do it now, and I'll put it on on a different layer. And so we can group objects, we can use different layers, or we can use the object drawing mode to control whether or not they interact with other objects. The last object here is the Polystar tool, and we can go to the tool settings, and so for example if you want to make a triangle, you'll set it to polygon, 3 sides, and then you're able to create triangles. So lots of stuff that you can do there with the very basic tools. I'm going to come and use the pencil tool, which is also kind of interesting. Let's see, I ran into the edge of my desk. Let's clear that out and make something that's fairly smooth. And then I'm going to duplicate it and one more time. And what happens is, actually, let's take the first one, and you'll notice that the setting, let's do this all over again. If I go to the pencil tool, here, I've got this setting, which is the pencil mode. The first one will be straighten. The second time, when I do the line, I'm going to use smooth. And we're not seeing great differences here. The third time, I'm going to use ink. And let me just move these, hold the shift key and get these on the screen. Now when I use my white arrow, what happens is I've got the fewest number of points and I've got a lot of corner points. Try and zoom in. You can see those all right, but the line is black. Here I've got fewer points. They're mostly curve points, and this is the most number of points on the line, the ink mode. So I've got straighten, curve, and ink, different ways to actually draw with the mouse. And you can use these for tracing. Using a mouse to trace an image works very well, and it will smooth the lines. You can export them to Illustrator, and if you need to create diagrams and things, that can be very useful. So the pencil tool is different. The brush tool works very much the same way. I've got different brush sizes and brush shapes. They're all right. This, I guess, is more calligraphic. And what happens is you can see that this is actually, when you look at the, let's change this color and see if I can get something else that will show up, maybe even a black, so that as you see the outline, this is actually a fill. So the pencil tool produces strokes, and the brush tool provokes a shape with a fill. There's one other brush here, which is the spray brush, and we can spray dots. Let's see, it uses, I believe, the pencil. So What you're going to use that for, I have no idea, but it's in there. Another useless tool that I'll show you just because it's here is the Deco tool. And I can click and drag and I get the vine fill. Takes a little while to draw, and once it draws, we'll erase it because I haven't thought of anything to do with it. But theoretically, you could fill an object with this bizarre vector vine pattern. Hopefully it'll finish soon. It's a little processor intensive, and let's get rid of that. The Deco tool also has some interesting things and some less interesting things. There's a grid fill. There is, for example, a building brush. Click and drag vertically and create buildings of different heights. Okay, if you need buildings, you know where they are. There's a fire animation. Here we go. And you can see it's actually creating keyframes on the timeline here. We'll talk about them later. Again, I haven't found a use for this tool, but it's full of special effects that you can play with and decide whether or not you think they're neat. The type tool is pretty straightforward. I'm going to get rid of these extra frames. We'll talk about keyframes in the next video. Modify timeline. It's not letting me delete the keyframes. There we go. Okay, sorry for delay. Trying to move quickly so that you can very quickly get to fooling around. Now, the bone tool is something we're going to leave alone for the moment. The other thing we'll leave alone is the 3D rotation tool because we haven't covered movie clips. But just to give you a brief idea, I'm going to go ahead and create a rectangle. I'm going to say convert to symbol. And once this is a movie clip, I can use this 3D rotation tool, and you can see that I can actually manipulate this space as a 3D plane. Has some uses. We won't use it much, but you see it and it's there. The fill tool is pretty straightforward, which is the paint bucket tool. There's also the ink bottle tool, which is for strokes. So to use the rectangle tool one more time, let's go ahead and change the fill here, and I can use the fill tool, and then let's change the stroke to red, and I will use the ink bottle and click, and I can change that to red. And here on my properties, I can, well, let's select that, and then I can adjust that stroke if I want. There's a lot of options in here to explore. The last piece that I want to show you, well, the transform tool is pretty straightforward. There is a gradient tool. I'm going to use the oval tool here, and this is going to feed into our next exercise. So I'm going to make two circles. Here's the first one. I'm going to delete the stroke. I'm going to option drag to create another duplicate object. And then I'm going to go to this fill, this color palette. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose a radial gradient. And I'm going to go ahead and peel this away for reasons which will become clear in a moment. Now, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to make a gradient that starts with white, and it goes with red, and it goes to black. And what's interesting, let me zoom in and see if I can get this to line up just about right. You will notice that if I position this right here, that the left edge of the radial gradient, which is the white dot, corresponds to the center of the gradient going to the outside. So imagine that this little gradient strip here is a window into the object behind it, and you can almost see it there. So that's a good way to think of where the gradient begins and ends. What I'm going to do here is I can use my gradient tool, which is here behind the transform tool, or I can use the paint bucket tool, and I can just position the center of the gradient right there, maybe in a little bit. If I deselect and zoom out, you can see I've got this nice billiard ball, which is this gradient masked by the circle. Now here, I'm going to do something similar. I'm going to choose a radial gradient. It's going to remember my settings, but what I want to do is make a shadow out of this, and I'm going to go from black to black. On the right side, on the outside, I'm going to set this alpha, which is transparency, to be transparent black. If I go black to white, I'm going to end up with a white halo on the outside, which won't work. Watch what happens. If I go to white and I set my alpha to 100, that looks okay. I'm going to move the center out, and I have this sort of feathered edge. But if I change my stage color, let's choose a light color. Can you see the white halo around the edges of that gradient? That's not working. So what I'm going to do here is change this, double click it, set it to black with an alpha, and then when I deselect, you can see this feathered edge goes all the way to the edge, and the transparency is there and the color is showing through. So now I have my two shapes. In the next exercise, what I'm going to do is talk about keyframes and animate these shapes.